Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today for our Modern Masonry, the original resilient design presentation. It's on behalf of Thames Valley Brick and Tile. My name's Sean Costello. I'm a master mason by trade, and I'm the architectural and technical rep for Thames Valley Brick. So appreciate, again, you coming and give us the time today. We'll follow up with your OAA structured Con Ed credit that you'll submit through the OAA portal on their website. So bear with us while we try to get through modern masonry. We'll touch on, first of all, some of the background history of Thames Valley Brick. Thames Valley Brick and Tile, as we say at the bottom there, over 1,500 various brick colors, textures, sizes, and profiles. Please have a visit to our website. It's the first step in selecting bricks for your new project. And always keep in mind, the lower the absorption rate, the better the brick is for resisting moisture and therefore resisting freeze-thaw cycles, brick falling off the face. And now that we've become just a veneer trade and no longer a structural trade, it's important that you pick the lowest absorption rate so your brick can work overtime for you on the wall. Some terminology when I was teaching a trade school, we're going to focus today on wide. Nowadays, as I said, we're just one brick wide, being the width of the brick for veneer. Historically, we would be double or triple wide, multiple walls built like so, 2, 3, 4, 5 brick deep. Most of our offices on the Spadina part of Toronto downtown, where all the architect offices are these days. Those are all adaptive reused buildings built from the early 1900s. That have been adaptively reused now into office buildings for architects. Originally, of course, it was the whole textile and clothing industry was downtown on Spadina Avenue. Here's some examples of heritage work in downtown Toronto. The Gladstone Hotel, Gladstone House. Across in the top right corner is a picture of a new build. It's a condominium on Gladstone, 2 Gladstone. That's one of our brick. So you can see how we can match the fabric and the color, the texture of heritage masonry in Toronto, and the dogtooth pattern on either side of the Roman arch, indicative of the kind of decorative work we used to do. Still viable though, still resilient design when you're incorporating that into thin brick on precast, which this is. It's the same sort of dogtooth panels set into that. And if you look at the top, you have the masonry corbelling out on the spandrel. So it's a corbelled spandrel and even circular brick soffits up above. So a very versatile system, thin brick on precast. We'll touch on that towards the end of our presentation today. Another nice picture of the same building. This is down in San Francisco. It's the baseball stadium. And brick soffits, brick facing, all of that's thin brick on precast. If you look close enough, I'm sure you can figure out how you can tell the difference between thin brick on precast panels and brick hand laid and all bonded together. Another example of the dogtooth, just to show you how we would traditionally have built these, with jack lines running down the wall to guide the airs of the brick as we're laying them. And of course, with thin brick on precast, everything's set into a liner, and then you pour the concrete on the back of it. So we're going to focus on types of walls and try to break them down. The very bottom, single wide, is what our trade is now, veneer trade, one wall, one masonry unit thick. Going back, we're going to focus a little bit on composite wall as well. And then, of course, precast wall panels, curtain wall, and metal frame walls. This is an example of heritage masonry. Each one of those brick Ys would have a continuous wall behind to back it up. You can count the number of Ys. Keep in mind, in stretcher position for 8-inch brick, it's the equivalent of 2 headers. So that'd be 2 Ys. So one stretcher is 2 Ys across, using some of our clay pavers to demonstrate that. So if you count them up, we'll resolve the answer for that at the end of our presentation. Basically, you're counting 2 Ys for one stretcher brick for the very first edge of the first Roman arch, and each one of those arches would have a different center or template to carry the load. And of course, arches have all kinds of parts, all kinds of questions in our intermediate level in masonry training for parts of the arch. We can talk about this further when you visit our booth. Some more information about arches. Some are 1 radius point, some are 2, some are 3, some are 4. They get a bit more complicated when you get into 4 radial points. Of course, we did a lot of this in scriptoriums when the cathedrals of Europe were being built, and cathedrals and other religious structures in other continents. And we always give Vitruvius the credit for architecture, but Vitruvius's work wasn't really rediscovered until the 1500s. So a lot of people figure Vitruvius's and the rediscovery of his books was really what was the impetus for starting, or the genesis of the Renaissance era of higher learning in Europe. Looking at barrel vaults, they would support massive machinery, massive trains all through any continents that had brick systems. Of course, the Great Wall of China, probably the most brick ever used in any project. Looking at this system here, all of those barrel vaults, once filled in and once the elevation was brought up and leveled, that would carry the weight of transport trains all over the world. So very resilient design systems. And of course, here's an example of us reducing walls from monolithic 15, 12, 14 Ys thick. Biggest I ever worked on in Toronto was the Royal Ontario Museum. It is 18 brick Ys at the base. It batters into 4 or 5 at the windows and corbels back out above to the same depth, 18 brick wide. So that's monolithic, load-bearing capacity, so you can build them long and square, but not very tall. Then we got into double-wide masonry, which is the header brick bonding across 2 Ys, as it says there. Then in the 50s and 60s, we got into composite walls with 2 walls bonded together with masonry or wire ties. You would build your block work and put in what we would call truss type reinforcing. If it was 10-inch walls, you'd have 8-inch wire. If it was a 6-inch wall, you'd have a 4-inch wire. So these sat inside the edges of your units and bonded across the collar joint, which is the joint between 2 Ys of masonry, regardless of their assembly. This would tie those walls together. Then the picture to your right is brick tied in header position on top of running bond brick to tie them together like so. And this backside of this brick is setting on the block, either on a ledge block like it shows there, or sitting right on 2 courses of block, which match 6 courses of our brick in metric system. And then you would bond that and then repeat the process to build again. And these are the areas, the backup walls is where our apprentices always work. And we're having a lot of trouble getting apprentices through their time served, which is about 5,800 hours, because we've lost a lot of our backup walls to steel stud and board. Carrying on then to show you another system that was very popular, that I was very familiar with in my career from the late 70s up until the mid 2000s. You would have a ladder type wire or joint reinforcement, it's called technically in your spec, on the top of block work as we're building. The tab would stick out from the wall to hold insulation. This is set up for 2-inch insulation. The tab would come on then and hold the brick in place. So what we're trying to do is transfer the load of the veneer back to the backup wall. We're doing that through the use of joint reinforcement and hardware clips. It's as simple as that. This, of course, like I said, would be sitting on the interior of the block. So imagine that that's a block. That's our wire embedded in the block. And then that's how we're clipping the other brick. And this all goes together as a cavity wall system with the air circulating through the cavity part of the wall to help pressurize the interior of the cavity to prevent water getting in through the face of the wall. So the better you can do that, the more solid the wall assembly, the more resilient it is, the better it is for preventing moisture getting drawn through the wall. Another quick idea of how we morphed into insulating that interior cavity prior to using blueskins or Air Block 21 or Air Block 31 that we used to spread on by trowel in the 80s. And that's clipping the brick again to transfer the load of the brick veneer back to the masonry. Very important feature in resilient design. This is another nice detail, a section of how we used to build all through 70s, 80s, 90s, even into the mid 2000s. Block walls of 8-inch that the mason apprentices could work on. An 8-inch block wall on its own is a sound transmission class of 54, believe it or not. Most walls assemblies that we compete with now, steel stud and board, are around 28 to 30 STC. So almost double the sound transmission class when you're using block backup walls. And again, if you notice, it mentions continuous joint reinforcing to transfer the load of the veneer back to the wall. What we're doing that with now in steel stud and board is 2 or 3 screws in the end of our anchor, and that would clip on the back side of a steel stud, and you would screw the back of it. These come out through the wall. You membrane and flash and insulate, and then this clip gets installed as we're doing our brickwork, and that clip right on top of the brick like so. So that's the face. That's our brick. That's set up onto the steel stud, our anchor, and that's clip is sitting on top of the brick for us to spread mortar on top of. And these clips are well designed because they give you a little bit of travel, so you can make sure you're always sitting level on top of the brick with your anchor. It's very important to make sure, again, that we're transferring that load back, which is the most important feature of the veneer. Another nice cavity wall layout. It's just showing that you used to use copper paper. I always carry a little piece of copper paper. It's a little bit beat up now from 2 years of traveling around with it. But that copper paper is what they're showing on that picture. Very good for coming out in flash. We used to sometimes even travel copper paper through the wall on top of the first course of block and the backup and lip it back out. And then when we were building our brickwork, we would come in with another flash up underneath this flashing. So we would have this type of lap to go underneath our brick with the second piece. That just gives you an overlap so the water or any moisture or air circ can do what it has to do in that cavity. Very important feature too. Another nice detail showing how we use mortar net to not dam up the wall too much in the interior if they're overspreading the mortar, which most masons don't want to do. But if they are, maybe they haven't had the greatest amount of training yet. This mortar net can be installed and also help in the circulation of air through the cavity. And of course, the air gets into the cavity through the use of our weepers and breathers that we have installed into the wall. So the weepers go on the bottom of the first course of brick, and the weepers are like so that we have our 2 brick up against each other, and that is set up like that. And then the top of the Goodco brick vent that this one is prevents us filling that cross joint with mortar so that the air can get in, and if moisture is getting into the cavity, it can get back out through that same weeper, or possibly the breather that's installed usually at the top of the wall. The breather vents can be color coded as well. They're not as expensive as the Goodco brick vents, but again, the air can get in and circulate through that cavity. If you notice, they're showing the weep vent there down at the bottom of that detail. Very good detail, this one too, for reference sake. Another nice detail showing a reglet cast into the wall. It's got a dovetail anchor. This dovetail anchor goes in sideways into that reglet and folds down. And again, it sits on top of the brick, same as the other anchors I was showing you. And again, to transfer the load of the brick veneer back to the backup wall. So a very important feature. The dovetail is an old type of system even used in carpentry. The reason why I mention it here, there's the same kind of dovetail slots on the back of our thin brick units. That's a thin brick meridian dimension, 16 inches. It's got a grooved back that's similar to the dovetail. So the matrix of concrete, when it's poured on the back of these walls to make panels, can key in to the edge of the groove. And again, it's the slump involved in the matrix of the concrete that allows it to key in to the grooves in the back of the thin brick and holds them to the face of the precast panel once it's tilted up and lifted into place. So then we got away from backup walls of concrete and concrete block and got more into steel stud and board. But if you notice, the system's still the same. We're still using a dovetail type of unistrut anchored through water resistant board right into the steel stud, and then we've got an anchor that slides down into those channels that we can place at certain levels as we're building. We almost always have them continuously in one elevation, but as we're building leads on the corner, the guys in the corner sometimes add their wire first so they can build a lead that we pull our line off of to guide us on the wall. So the 2 end masons are always building leads, as we call them, up above the elevation we're working on, while the other masons in between are filling in and trying to keep up level And you're usually working as a team and have spaced out the wall so everybody's doing the same amount of work. Carrying on then, this is very similar to what we would do in residential construction now. Important part of this slide, top left corner, showing another anchor system for, could be used in either residential or institutional and commercial. Again, it's got that play on the anchor, if you notice in that picture. So there's a lot of movement that it can come up and down wherever we need it. So even if our clip is down slightly in the middle of this brick, we have enough play to allow it to sit on the brick itself. So that 1.5 inches of play is more than half of a course of brick, and it's always enough to allow us to locate that anchor, very importantly, level and flush to the top of the brick. So again, when the mortar's on top and the next brick goes and the load of that veneer transfers down and locks it in place, it helps transfer that load back to the backup wall. That's the most important part of the feature. And again, we've changed all of that heavy hardware into screws into studs, but we always screwed into studs anyways for City of Toronto wall ties. So we're not really reinventing the wheel. It's not any less resilient. It's just a different approach to doing the same type of brick veneer design. Just to finish off with cavity walls, and again, the important feature for me, the important point to make is the cavity air gap, the middle section of those bullet points, equilibrating the pressure so as to reduce water infiltration. The important thing is that when the wind hits the face of that wall, we want it to get in through the weepers and breathers to pressurize the interior of the cavity so there's no push-pull and it doesn't suck through the wall micro cracks in the mortar joints and bring moisture into the wall. That's the reason why the weepers are there. If the weepers are constantly weeping moisture, we've probably done something wrong further up the building with the veneer. Another nice detail showing cavity wall. This one just emphasizes the through the wall aspect. If you look what it says, rigid flashing to span across drainage cavity. And then the bubble, the blow up of that picture, it shows the flashing going right in, right up the face of the block and then on to the block itself. So it's almost a through the wall flash. They used to be very standard at one time. I was surprised to see that one leave and that we've become on the wall with all our flashing. Nothing any longer is through the wall. Just a couple of more details showing different hardware. The City of Toronto wall tie in the top left picture, the anchor to the left. You always have your nail no further away than a 25 mil from the bend in that wall tie because you don't want it to deflect when the load's being transferred. Carrying on, some more detailing there showing how decorative you can become again. As we talked about in the first two slides, you see some heritage mortar or masonry, and now we're showing you similar that can be done on thin brick on precast now. So all of those bonds are back in play. If you look at it too, the stack bond is the one that requires double hardware because again, it's not locking together. So always keep in mind, if you want to do a stack bond system, very popular with glass block, by the way, stack bond, one of our glass blocks units. It's nice for light getting in, but it's foggy so people can't see through. So it's a privacy glass block. Even it has its own hardware that sits in continuously. Because we're doing stack bound almost always with block, you almost put this hardware every course. And whenever you do buy glass blocks, make sure you always buy all the accessories because the one time you think you're good enough that you don't need the spacers to keep the joints consistent is the one time all the weight starts to transfer down when you're building on the wall because maybe your mortar's a bit too soupy. And on the right side on this slide, it just shows you some more different mortar joint side profiles, the types of mortar joints you can specify for your work. This picture here is Flemish bond. And from the queen closures, which are the blue cuts on the ends, the quarter cut is called the queen closure to establish the pattern on the wall. If you notice, everything is on 1/4 lap or 3/4 lap, depending on which way you want to say it, with the headers in relation to the stretchers. If you were to build this panel without the brown headers in the middle, that would create a solar screen to allow air and light to travel through the wall. Very popular application in warm weather cultures and climates where you want a bit more air coming into, say, your courtyards, but you still want security. And the play of shadow with the sunlight wouldn't be as hot in your courtyard all day because you're screening it. Thus the name solar screen for these types of panels. Very popular in design these days, solar screens. Just to prove to you that the masons were always there first, to the left is a spiral. You start with a square like you would for a chimney, and then you step each corner a quarter inch as you're building, and then you eventually start turning the column. This was very popular when we were turning a chimney through the roof line. And if you look to the right is the picture of an architect designed a building that's slowly twisting like a spiral as well. So as always, we like to say the masons are always there first. Another example of that, picture to the right, beautiful house down in the United States. And if they're doing running bond, and as they came to this section where they wanted a solar screen to bring air into their air handling units, they slowly opened up the bond to eventually create their own Flemish bond. And if you notice, these bricks are solid in the area where the Flemish bond was established as they're stretching, as they're pulling the stretchers further and further. And then, of course, the picture to your left shows the exact same application. So that building is actually a Flemish bond building. Maybe the architects did or didn't know that. Maybe they were inspired by masonry, I'd like to think. But again, it shows you how the masons were almost always there first. So sometimes when you're looking at old masonry, you can get some fantastic designs ideas for your modern designs of buildings, adaptive and versatile, so very resilient. Just like to show this one so you guys could compare and contrast this one to any details you might be working on these days that have steel stud and board. A lot of big heavy duty design, resilient design in this slide alone, just in this one simple slide, especially even the bond beam. So without steel over the window in a fire condition, you got 4 hours of fire resistance from that cast in place bond beam of solid concrete with the rebar set back, so the heat of the fire won't affect it like it would exposed steel. Just showing a few more flash details through the wall and through to the back of the wall so the roofer can come in and lap to that. Composite wall assembly with through-wall flashing for future lap to roofing membrane. Very important that we leave stuff always flapping in the air for the other trades to join to. Roofers are usually the only guys who come after us on the job up at the top. Just some more ideas of how to work on your parapet. Keep in mind your parapet height is established by 3 times the least lateral dimension in your structural wall assembly. So if it's a 4-inch steel stud backup wall, you can only go 12 inches with your parapet above the roof line, which sometimes isn't enough to get above the ballast and insulation on the roof. So keep in mind when you're selecting a wall finish for ground floor elevation, carry that right through to the roof line to understand what's going to happen up at the roof when I design this type of wall layout, especially cavity wall systems. These are just really good reference parts of the slide to make sure you're doing your flashings, your step flashings, your reglet installs, all of the work that you're supposed to do up on the roof to make sure everything works together. A lot of this can be done on the mock-up as well. And the very nice detail from the AIA, coping and parapet detail, just shows you how your coping or your cap of the parapet wall should always slope into the roof. So we don't have to have those beware of falling ice signs when you're not sloping it to the roof, or if you're trying to put in a flat, a level cap. You can't do that. You always have to have a coping that splays back to the roof line to shed the water there and go to our rainwater leaders. Another nice example of a monolithic assembly, just to finish off with this for the parapet wall, because that's a 1 stretcher, 2 headers laid out for a bond. You've got 16 inches of masonry, so 3 times 16 inches, which is the structural dimension, gives you a 48-inch parapet wall. Where all the offices are in downtown Toronto for architects, especially in Spadina area, all of those buildings have 4-foot tall parapet walls because most of them are at least 4 bricks. Some of them are 6, some are 8, some are 10 brick wise deep. And like I said, the ROM was 18 bricks deep, if you can imagine. That's when we used to get our legendary production days in the old days of 1,200 brick a day. So movement joints, where they're located and why we locate them. Usually it's more from differential wall movement, which is different materials expand and contract at different rates. Usually for clay units, we're talking expansion joints, and for concrete units, it's control joints. Just to differentiate the two, but we classify them all under movement joints now, and we can discuss this further if you visit us in our booth, as well as where we locate these. Just to finish off on parapet, you always have a movement joint underneath the parapet wall, so you should always rake that joint back to cock it so it can have a bit more movement. If it's a block backup wall, if it isn't, if it's just steel stud and board, you can deal with the steel stud people for that. And then the vertical joints, where they're located, we can discuss further on a booth visit or at the end of our show. And of course, how they deal with it. I know we say here in the red, sometimes they're not aesthetic. But we're going to jump you to a slide here that's very aesthetic. It still does the same job, and it's a very well located one. And again, as it says in red, if you don't use them, Mother Nature will make you use them. So there's an example of it being used. If you remember my slide earlier showing those blue queen closures against the header on the corner, you notice in this slide here where the crack is 4 courses up on the red brown brick, it's through a 3/4 cut against the header. That should have been a queen closure against the header. With the half header there where the crack is, that might have prevented the crack from happening or at least controlled it a bit better. But again, always chase your bond from the top down as opposed from the bottom up to see what kind of wall assembly you have. Here's an example of a very aesthetically pleasing movement joint built into the wall with a preformed gasket as a mortar bed, all compressed as you build it. You push down enough that it compresses enough to stay in place. We might have used wedges to hold it in place while the mortar's set up, and then when the caulker comes along to fill the gap that's left, he puts his backer rod after he pulls the wedges out, puts his backer rod, does his caulking. The Performing Arts Center in downtown Toronto, just to mention one, there's no straight movement joints or control joints in that whole building. They're all tubed out like this. And I always make a point of driving out of town that way on Richmond, and I can have a quick visual, and you can see in some areas it's pinched together and bubbled out a little, and in some areas it's stretched a little. So they're really doing a great job of controlling the movement in that building. Fair play to the designers on that one. Here's a nice straightforward list for your mock-up. All these things should be considered when you're doing your mock-up. And even if you can incorporate to the right, second one down, all of this in the above, which is the mason's responsibility, plus flashing, capping, roof to membrane, to wall lap. You can also simulate electrical box in the wall, a pipe through the wall. So all those things are resolved by the architect in a meeting of the sub-trades around the mock-up with the construction manager or the general contractor, depending on what you've selected to run your building. And again, consistency of the mortar profiles, all of this stuff can be resolved in a mock-up way ahead of you doing the elevation. Even the precasters supply mock-ups. This is one of their mock-ups I'm showing right here, as well as some of our high-end brick. This is probably one of our best bricks, the Iron Squad. You can see the sun or the light reflecting off that one. Very true, very solid brick too. And another example of one of their bricks. These are the pavers that could match, square edge pavers. I'll show you some more of those. These are a thinner paver to go on top of a concrete bed. So some of these are fantastic items. We'll touch on those in a few more slides here. So just moving away from composite walls and brick veneer to thin brick. We have many different applications of thin brick that are hand installed, not precast, but these are thick bed, thin bed, field installed or panelized. There's our thick set description showing our details, thin brick, bond coat, scratch coat, and then lathing or mesh. Some of the new systems that have been introduced into the industry lately. These are the ones we show from Delta. It's a nice water resistive barrier. Bubble board, some people might call it, on the back. Front face has got fiberglass mesh as opposed to the wire meshes we used to use. And that's what you take your bond coat or your scratch coat first. Your bond coat goes on top of that. Then you're back buttering these brick as you stick them on the wall. Always going and coursing like you would as masons. So some nice products out there to make it a little bit easier. We can give you some contacts if you need them for those. Then we got thin set. Very similar, but just not as much mortar applied, so a little lighter. But again, thin brick, thin set mortar, glass fiber mesh tape, as I showed you on the back. Cement board, drainage mat is optional. We wouldn't say it's optional in Ontario, but it says optional there. That's our tab system that we would retail. These are different, whereas the panel goes on, the clips support the brick. You have glue on the back of the brick to stick into the metal panel. There's a side clip that bends up and holds the brick in place while the glue sets up. And then the next day you come in and you would point mortar in between the brick itself on the wall to fill the mortar joints. So it still requires a lot of skill to install thin brick on walls like this. Just to show there's no cheating just because it's thin brick. You still have a weep screed for a flashing at the bottom. You're still lapping your water resistive barrier or water resistive board over the weep screed flange so as to allow for that step flashing as we showed you earlier with the parapet walls. and the way we do layouts for base flashings as well on buildings, where we would have one sticking out through the wall and fold another one up underneath it. Again, always having that overlap. Another quick detail of the head. If you remember that slide earlier, the head detail I showed you, if you take that slide, this slide, and compare the both two of them to what you're detailing today, you could see that there might have been a change in the resiliency in some of the design. Thin brick goes back quite a way. It's not a new invention. It's not a new way of doing masonry. It was very popular in a really rainy climate that England was in 1794 and into the 1800s. A lot of that was to do with their coal and using coal for industry and for heating. The environment was conducive to more rain from the clouds created from the coal dust. Hard to believe. And again, back to thin brick on precast. This would be very similar to one of these beautiful bricks. This is a corner pre-made to go around corners for all of those columns. If you notice, there's a straight movement joint between all those columns. Probably display the corner a little bit, because if you can notice, it's not a flat column, it's slightly splayed from the corner. But again, all of these are pre-made, various sizes and thicknesses. We've got this size, we've got this size to allow you to do some decorative, so one can step out from the face of the other because the thicknesses are different. We'll show you a slide here in a second that incorporates that aspect. But this is a project down in Boston. Beautiful work, dogtooth again, even circles and turns. All not you're not limited at all in what you can design for in thin brick on precast. This is an idea of the liners that hold the brick in place while the concrete matrix is being poured. We have some of those available, and I can show you the brick right here on this slide. There's our liner, or on this picture. That's our thin brick put into the liner, held in place. There's wax on the face of these brick that you wash off after to keep them clean before you install the panels. And again, these brick have a little slight groove in them like the dovetail, so the matrix of concrete goes over that and keys it and holds it in place. Very important part of the feature. The liners we like to use are the single-use liners that all clip together. The one in black to the left is a rubberized multi-use. Careful with that though, because eventually after repetitive pours, it starts to wear down the edges of the of that liner. They're a lot more expensive too than the single use, so it's a decision to be made, usually in consultation with your precasters. Some precasters prefer one system and others prefer others. So it's something to do when you're consulting through us. We can help you out with all of that aspect of getting involved with a precast design for your building. Again, this is another detail showing you the thicker brick that I just was holding up. And that gives you a nice a two-plane elevation on your brick veneer. So you're using a thinner brick and a thicker brick, but stuck into the same liner. The liner itself would be deeper for these wider brick than they are for this brick. That allows you to do decorative work like that. So really unlimited in what you can think of in thin brick on precast. So points to remember. Give you a chance to read that one while I gather myself. lots to talk about in a 6,000-year-old trade, and hard to squeeze in the modern aspects of it in 45 minutes. That's why we look forward to seeing you all at our booth this week. Please drop by, bring a few friends. Thin brick in the liner, as we showed you earlier. The liner is clicking together to the left to make a bigger spandrel or a bigger panel. Bottom left side is the concrete matrix going in over the brick. That picture isn't representative of a bit, should be a bit soupier, a bit more water, so a higher slump should be used for this. Usually the slump's 10 or 11 inches. This slump here would be around about 6, like you would pour a sidewalk. And then the bottom picture to your right, they've stood the panel up in the yard. They're washing off all the wax, cleaning off some of it with the scraper before they hot wash it all right off. It's a natural wax. There's no concerns about it flowing to the sewers in the areas where they're washing it off. These are thin brick on precast. If you look close enough to the picture on the left, you can figure out how you could tell that it's thin brick on precast because they didn't take their time with the dimensions. We didn't match maybe the brick units to the dimension you require. That's the kind of stuff, if you consult with us early on your design model, we can make sure you're picking a brick that'll have a liner to suit, or more so than anything else, you have a dimension that works for full bond. So you have half and full bricks on both ends. There's no pieces in between unless, of course, you're doing a decorative bond, whereas the corners are always full units and all the decoration is in the inside, so it looks as real as possible. And another example of a brick panel ready to be poured on the left with some signage built into it. There's some spacers to hold their wires in place. There's even some hardware down on the bottom, if you notice, on the left-hand picture below the sign, to allow them to stand this panel up once poured and stand it in place. They were going to use this as a sign for their building. And on the right is the automated machinery, magnetic metal table that vibrates to consolidate the concrete once you've poured it. And even the concrete pour system comes over on a gantry, drops down on a crane, and pours in place when they're ready to go. All of that's magnetic. All of it's run by robots from a control room to a CAD program on a design scheme of a drawing that's set up and scanned into the system. So very state-of-the-art too. We've got some companies that are old school that are still doing wooden carpentry, and then we have these new state-of-the-art companies that do all of this with magnets, steel frames, and reusable metal platforms and tables. They have about 6 lines in a massive factory, and there's constantly moving these panels up and down till they're finally poured and then put into a sweating chamber so they can slow cure them, so there's no quick drying and no shrinkage in the units. So clay brick paving, coming back, very popular now. Shows you it goes back as far as a detail here that I have found that was from the 1914s. 1915s. They're using actually wooden blocks, and from my perspective, they're using them as movement allowance. So there's a little bit of flexibility in the paving, but also that it's always locked together and very deep, if you notice too, they're pavers. So all of this is set up on a matrix of gravel or concrete on gravel, just to show you some basket weave on the right and some herringbone on the left with a hazard alert paver for visibly impaired, that they can feel that as they're walking or using their cane as well. And also for people totally absorbed in their iPhones, they can feel that now as they're walking and getting closer. We have the beautiful clay pavers with hazard alert bubbles on top of them that you see at all the street corners these days. And then square edge pavers, as well as pavers with lugs. The lugs allow a space between the pavers, and that's where you get permeable paving. The water permeates down through the cross joints in the pavers. You fill that cross joint with an aggregate as opposed to a polymeric sand to allow for moisture to get through. And then we also have the square end pavers that were used in the distillery district. If you look at our backup here, this is all distillery district right here with a range of different colored bricks. Then you see the herringbone. This is also up at Trent University. So we've had a lot of our pavers, clay pavers, again, with a very, very low absorption rate, which is the key. They don't lose their color. They don't lose their shine because of the matrix of clay and shale. And they keep their tread resistance as well. They don't wear down as quickly. They're not a smooth unit. So when you get a bit of ice underneath your feet and step on a smooth unit, you have a tendency to have a little slip. This is also pavers in a smaller width, so you can turn a corner quicker. Very important for getting around a corner, a tight radius close to this fountain. As you got further away from the fountain, the radius, of course, is getting bigger. Even though the formula is the same, you're still using a longer unit as you get wider with a circular install. So keep in mind, if you ever want to do circular, the narrower the unit, the quicker it is for that to turn on a corner. Again, some more details showing sidewalk plaza on compacted aggregate, or something to do with the driveway as well, partial depth concrete edge restraint, and the difference of small edge restraint and larger edge restraint. So getting involved with load-bearing walls, which are 2 types, buttressed and counterfort, when you're holding back earth. So one, the earth is on top of it as it is to the right. The other, the earth is up against it as it is on the left. Some more nice long straight lines of paving. Very nicely done. This is the Pan Am Games residences, downtown Toronto near the distillery. This is very similar to what we did when I worked on CIBC Place in the back courtyard, doing the tree pits there and all the tree rings around Commerce Court. You would have drainage sloping to the planting strip areas to allow the moisture that drains off in rainfall and melting snow to feed the trees, so the trees have enough water. So again, you're not constantly maintaining the trees with water every day, and you have enough area to allow all your water to drain away on your surface, so you're not dealing with ice concerns. And again, the 2% grade of slope on the sidewalk standard for City of Toronto. The inspectors would always put their level on the sidewalk and read the bubble and know that they got the right 2% grade. Another nice little quick slide of our pavers, and again showing you the lugs. We have a few more here. These ones are thinner for being laid right on flat onto a concrete base, like we would lay brick on the wall. We can lay brick onto solid concrete. Show you a few slides of that in a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds. And again, a Whitaker Greer paver with the lugs on it. And again, just to show you the gap that's created between, when you use that system, is where your permeable paving occurs. It doesn't really permeate through the pavers, because if you think about that, if it was able to permeate through the pavers, they wouldn't be able to take any load. So some nice detailing there of 3 of our bricks, square edged, and again, low absorption rate is the key. One last slide showing permeable paving. As I showed you the lugs, keep a gap between the brick. This is exaggerated in this slide, the gap. But again, the moisture can get down through, and that amount of gravel there and that depth, if you're really deep or have a problem with an area where you have nowhere to run water to, if you go to your lowest spot, dig a hole, fill it with gravel, you can create your own French drain, they call them. Then all your moisture is run to them through weeping tile, like we would have around the base of the building. So when you're stuck for a place to run water to, or you don't know where to run it, again, take it to the lowest point on the property, and if you have to, dig a hole, fill it with gravel, and you've got a very good French drain. It's named after a gentleman named French. It wasn't named after the French. Just a detail showing you different bonds for your clay paving layouts. You're not limited at all. And again, these same bonds can go on the wall for thin brick on precast. Very similar. Again, the same trade does all these applications, so it's nothing for us to do these on the wall or on the floor. And you even got some polychrome, some 2-colored systems. And one more shot of the permeable paver with 2-inch of number 8 wash stone, and then number 57 stone. So different classifications, 3/4, 1.5 inches is what we would call those two. But in Ontario. And this is an example of using a thinner clay paver. So not as expensive, a lot rougher the texture, nice and thin. You can lay these right on a concrete base, sub-base on a mortar bed, like we would lay brick. And you get nice and close to the surface. We would almost have a line on that, a vertical line on the floor to work to as we're working. And we'd probably have a line down the middle, making sure our slope is consistent. And we would probably twig that line in the middle so there's always a slight crown, because the first rainfall after a really good paving job is the biggest heart attack for us on site, because we're making sure there's no little areas where there was a little hollow and any water can form. Because if there was, there's no point in us waiting for the deficiency list. We knew we had to get in there and probably pick up about 5 or 10 of those and relay them so there was no dip area for water to settle, especially in our climate where we can have freeze-thaw cycles, quite a few in 1 week. Another beautiful layout, same idea, a 1-inch thick clay paver on a concrete base. Some nice diamonds, diapers they're called in our trade. Diaper is Latin for diamond, and it's a nice checkerboard pattern, I guess we would call this one. We do retail glass block. We have the biggest line of glass block available in Canada. Very extensive resource for bringing light into a building. And again, even glass block has wire joint reinforcement for glass block, because they're almost always stacked, is double the wire requirement. So double the hardware for stack block always, stack bond, and glass block is almost always stacked one on top of the other. 2-inch wire for 4-inch glass block. Remember that from my specifications. So Sevy's Glass Block is the main company we carry. The biggest amount of glass block I ever did was on the police headquarters in downtown Toronto. That was all supplied by Thames Valley Brick. We did a lot of glass block in the CIBC Center, even glass block floors with a thick, solid glass block that was 1.5 inches thick. Imagine that, laid on floors, so light from above came through the canopy of CIBC downtown, Canada Trust Tower, BCE place, where the Hockey Hall of Fame is. Light comes through the canopy, shines right through the glass block floor. Beautiful visual there. Glass block, beautiful range of colors. You can do serpentine walls, as this one is. Then spectre glazed block, our last slides. Glazed tile fused to the face of block. You can get any color. So you're doing 2 trades with 1 specification. Glazed block and glazed brick, very popular. Very resilient design. Splayed corners, any size, shapes, and colors. If you notice, they use the black at the base, so when they're doing their mopping and any dirt and damage, any banging of machinery that maybe was polishing the floor, you don't have to worry about the maintenance. You're paying upfront costs for the high-end units, but you have less maintenance costs in the long run. Graffiti-proof, antibacterial proof, fire-resistant, sound transmission class, all passive features of walls like this. Change room areas, all moisture-proof, so mold-resistant. Usually float grouted with proper tile grout that's antibacterial as well. So you can see the applications. Hockey rinks, dressing rooms. Nothing worse than doing regular block work and painting it, and then that's where the mold and mildew will attack as the paint's put onto the face of the block wall. So if you take an extra step and specify a glazed block, you're going to get 2 with 1. In our last slide here, these are some examples of how you can bond out block work and spectra glaze, but also how you can bond out thin brick on precast. Since some precast units now are bigger and bigger, as you can see with this long meridian length thin brick. So our question would be, when we talk our Q&A today, my question to you guys is going to be, which of these 2 panels of the 6 require extra hardware because they're not walking together? So it's very important that we understand why we use hardware and how it's being used to transfer loads and to stabilize walls in bond. So 2 of those panels require double the hardware of the other 4 because of the bond that's been used for them. So hopefully you enjoyed that presentation. We'll start right away with our 15-minute Q&A. There's my contact info and our website info as well if you need access to our website to look at our portfolio, which would be your first step in selecting brick for your project. And we can always help with that approach too. Thank you very much.
Just following up with the questions as they've come in. Our first question here is from Shashank regarding, would we have a corner detail for the thin brick application? We can just show you one as it is right now. Basically, the thin brick is pre-cut, preset to go around the corner. So basically your backup work, as those 3 slides were showing, depending on which system you're selected, you would do all of your finished backup work and return the corners just as you would doing laps from stud to stud. And your thin brick application then would follow the coursing and wrap around. And of course, you're reversing these as you go, because on some areas you're returning this way, then the next course, of course, you're lapping. So basically, there's your corners, just like that. Hopefully that explains that question. Second question was regarding how do you mitigate issues with thin brick freeze and thaw, and the OAA insurance requirement of clear ring screen systems design and air gap. The best way to explain that would be, regardless of what your backup material is, you're putting your membrane on it. Then, as we were discussing in one of my slides, I was showing it, the bubble wrap. This would be going on top of your blue skin, your membrane, whatever you've selected, the Delta air vent. That's your air gap. The bubble provides that. You can have different dimensions of bubble for different size of air gap, but that will allow your airflow, because the airflow is from the veneer to the interior cavity. It's not supposed to get through the membrane. So that's the key issue of mitigating any issues, is that the moisture or nothing can get through the membrane system that's being installed. Just to carry on with the next question here. That previous question was from Hassan Ibrahim. Thanks very much for that question, Hassan. Please too follow up with emails to me if I'm a little vague in some of these. Now, with the building science movements call for air tightness, the 1-inch brick veneer airspace creates convection air movement. Have you come across how much constant air loss is created by the weep holes in our colder climate? Keep in mind, again, the weep holes, as we're showing right here, for example, right in front of this setup, that's a good co-brick vent installed between 2 brick. So keep in mind, your brick veneer is outside of the air building envelope. The brick veneer is just simply that, a veneer with a rain screen principle, so it's stopping moisture getting inside. The suck or the pull of moisture through the micro cracks in the wall occurs when there's air loss in the building itself. So again, it goes to the backup wall and what material you've selected as a membrane, because that is what's stopping the air. The air is allowed to circulate in through the weepers, and at the top of the wall, we have brick vents. You can see that in the cross section, it's corrugated. You just see the air coming through or the light. So these are usually at the top of the wall. These vents here at the bottom of the wall, that allows for the air circulation through it to pressurize the cavity, so there's no through the wall because of the pull of the air into the building. If anybody's tried to open a fire door to go to a parking elevation and sees and recalls how much pull is on that door as you're trying to pull the door open, it's resisting because of the air in the building itself. That's exactly what we're trying to allow for in air cavity circulation. So it keeps everything pressurized and again, keeps it from getting soaked inside, so there's a chance for it to pressurize and dry out through an air cycle as well. That was the question from Lowell. Appreciate that question too. And Shannon Wiley's asking, is there durability concerns? Bear with me here. If there's any durability concerns. So I believe we're just at the end of our presentation. I seem to have lost the just to finish off, my email, Sean@ThamesValleyBrick.com, all one word, to follow up on any of those questions. And if Ibrahim and Shashank could send me an email there, I could follow up further with those questions we were discussing earlier. And once again, appreciate the time everyone could give us today. Durability concerns. Sorry, Shannon, I'm just seeing the rest of your question here. Well, again, for your resilience question, good question, Shannon, about the, Shannon's asking the durability concerns when you're exposing the top of the brick to weather. Again, if they're a very, very low absorption rate, like most of our brick, the higher end brick are that we retail, the lowest absorption rate for our brick would be about 1.8%. Most residential brick lines are upwards of 4 and 5%. So again, if you're concerned about what brick are you being used to cap a wall, say, there's different resiliency for different brick designed for that. You can actually even ask for pre-made shapes that would cap a wall. A lot of times, if you follow building code section 9 for chimney caps, it's the best way to flash and finish off the top of a building. That requires that you have a rubber membrane and a metal flashing underneath the cap of the top of the chimney. So again, because we've encountered problems like that in the past, so I've always instructed anybody designing and wants to know how to cap a masonry wall, follow the rules of capping for a chimney, and you're basically covering all the variables that could be there, including the fact that your cap should always be 30 mil past the face of the brick, and then the drip edge cut 10 mil back underneath that drip edge. So even for doing a windowsill, you're usually having your brick step out 30 mil minimum, 1.25 inches from the edge of the face of the brick. So any moisture hitting the brick sill comes off the edge and drips down and doesn't drip down back onto the face. We can help out some more with that too, Shannon. If you send me an email, Sean@ThamesValleyBrick.com, we should be able to help you with any of those questions. And thanks, everybody. Please visit us in the virtual conference lounge. And appreciate everybody coming by today. Thank you very much. Have a great day now. Bye-bye.